I want to provide a brief overview of pensions. Now, a pension plan is an asset pool that accumulates over an individual's working years and is paid out during the non-working years. Okay, so what do we mean by that? It's a pool of assets, and it's going to grow, hopefully, and it's going to be used to fund someone's retirement. Now, they were developed as Americans began relying less on children for care during their later years. If you go back in time, people would live with their children would take care of them. But now people move away, people don't necessarily have children, so they have to have money to care for themselves. And we've set up a pension system. Okay? They've also become popular because people's life expectancy has increased. Okay? It used to be that people essentially worked up until the day they died, so they didn't really need a pension plan. Now people retire at sometimes as young as 50 or 55, but even if they work until they're 65 or 70, they may live for another 20 or 25 years, so they need money to fund this retirement. Now, there are a couple of types of pension plans. The one that most of us think of as a pension is the defined benefit pension plan. And this is a plan where the sponsor promises the employee a specific benefit when they retire. The sponsor is the employer. So, for example, there might be a formula that says that a person's annual retirement payment is going to be 2% times the average of the final 3 years of income times the years of service. So someone who worked longer or made more money during their final 3 years is going to have a larger pension than someone who made less or worked less years. Defined benefit pension plans place a burden on the employer to properly fund the expected retirement benefit payouts. Okay, this can be difficult to determine because of this future liability. It's very difficult to figure out what the future liability is. I mean, you have to determine first how many people are going to stay employed. Some people will quit working for you before they even their benefits even vest. We'll talk about that in a moment. Some people will quit and move on to another job, so the benefits they receive are rather small. Some people will die. Some people will work until they're 70 years old and then live to be 100. Some people will retire at 70 and die at 71. So it's hard to know exactly what the benefit is going to be. But they use actuaries to work out the actuarial amount, okay, statistically, how much should be in the account. A fully funded account means sufficient funds are available to meet the payouts based on the assumptions. And the assumptions should be realistic. You can't assume that the assets will be invested and earn 20% a year if that's not realistic. Okay, it would certainly make it look like you have more money in your account than you do. You have to use realistic numbers. A pension plan, a defined benefit pension plan, can be overfunded. It can have too much money in there. So if it has more money than it needs, the company might make smaller contributions in the future, or perhaps they might increase benefits in the future. The pension plan can also be underfunded. That is, it doesn't have enough money in there to meet the required benefit payouts, and that can be a problem. Okay, and it can happen because if the assets don't perform as well as projected, if the fund expects assets to grow at 8% a year and they're only growing at 4% a year, it's going to be underfunded at some point, and there are rules that determine how much money they have to put in to, make up that underfunding. Defined contribution pension plans are plans where a set amount is invested for retirement, but the benefit payout is uncertain. The employer does not face an unknown future liability because they're going to perhaps make a contribution. They don't necessarily have to make a contribution, but in many cases they do. You have the two most popular 401ks. That's a retirement defined contribution pension plan for people in the private sector. There's a 403B, which is a defined contribution plan for people in the for nonprofits. People work at universities, okay, or other types of nonprofit institutions, schools, etc. Now, the amount of the benefit is unknown, and it's going to depend on how much the employee contributes and the performance of those assets where the money is invested. So if the employee invests in very safe assets like money market funds that return very, very little, that person may not have very much in their account when they retire. On the other hand, if the person contributes the maximum amount, invests in stock funds, and those funds perform very well, that person may have a lot of money when they retire. Okay, some employers may have some sort of matching contribution. Okay, they're not required generally to make a contribution, but some will match. For example, they might match 50 cents on the dollar up to the first 4% that the employee contributes. So, as a general rule, any employee should try and put in at least enough to get the employer match. And the employer match oftentimes is in the employer's stock. Now here's a table, and I don't know how well you can see it, but let me just go over it. It compares defined benefit plans with defined contribution plans. Now, here we're going to look at the employer contributions and or matching contribution. Usually in a defined benefit plan, it's employer funded. Federal rules set amounts that employers must contribute to the plan in an effort to ensure that the plans have enough money, that is fully funded. There are penalties for failing to meet these requirements, etc. Over here on the defined contribution plan, there's no requirement that employer contribute except in certain kinds of retirement plans. Okay, the employer may choose to match a portion of the employee's contribution or to contribute without employee contribution. So an employer could just say, look, I'm going to stick $10,000 in an employee's 401k account. You don't have to put in anything to get the match. If you want to put in more based on whatever the legal limits are, you can do so. But even if you don't put in anything, I'm going to put $10,000 in for you. Employee contributions. Generally, employees don't contribute to defined pension plans. For defined contribution plans, many require the employee to contribute. Okay, sometimes the employer doesn't contribute at all, so if the employee doesn't contribute, there's nothing in there. In many cases, you get a match, but the match requires that the employee make a contribution. Managing the investment in a defined benefit plan, there's going to be some professional management that takes care of this, managing the assets. In a defined contribution plan, the employee is responsible for managing the investments, okay, deciding which assets to invest in, what's the allocation, should they have 50% bonds, 50% stocks, 80% stock, 20% bonds, etc. That's a decision the employee has to make. Amount of benefit paid on retirement in a defined benefit plan, well, that's what the definition is. There's a promised or defined benefit, okay, based on some formula. Here, the benefit depends on how much the person contributes and how well those assets perform. So someone who puts the maximum amount into their 401k or 403b and chooses assets that perform very well over their lifetime may have a lot of money to retire on, but somebody who makes very small contributions and chooses very safe assets that have very low returns may not have enough to live off of. Type of retirement benefit payments. In a defined benefit plan, these are usually paid monthly. So if you work for the federal government, you get your pension check every month. If you worked for certain companies, now a lot of them are getting rid of their defined benefit plans or moving to defined contribution plans. But, they would send a check. General Motors would send a check to employees, and you would get a monthly check, again, based on some formula they have. In the case of the defined contribution plan, the retiree may transfer the account balance into an individual retirement account from which the retiree withdraws money, or may receive it as a lump sum payment. Okay. Some plans also offer monthly payments through an annuity. Okay. That may be a good idea for some people who have a hard time deciding how much to take out. If they take out too much in the early years, they may not have enough to retire off of. Guarantee of the benefits. In a defined benefit plan, the federal government, through the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, PBGC, guarantees some amount of the benefits. They guarantee the vested amount. In the case of a defined contribution plan, there's no federal guarantee of the benefits. Leaving the company before retirement age. If an employee leaves after vesting in a benefit, but before the plan's retirement age, the benefit generally stays with the plan until the employee files a claim for it at retirement. Some defined benefit plans offer early retirement options. Okay, so the money would stay there. If it's a defined contribution plan, the employee may just transfer the money into an individual retirement account, or in some cases into another employer plan where it can continue to grow based on investment earnings. So they call that a rollover. So you can roll the money from your 401k into an IRA or into perhaps your new employer's 401k account. And there's some rules there. You should do it correctly. You should check with an accountant before you try and do that, because if you do it incorrectly, you may incur some tax penalties if you don't do it correctly. Okay, vesting. I mentioned vesting before. Vesting essentially deals with when the employee is entitled to the contributions made by the employer. Okay, now in terms of the employee's own contributions, those are always fully vested. So if I put money into my 401k, that's always mine. Okay, if I leave the business in a year, that's my money, I put it in. But the money that my employer gave me or matched for my contribution may not be available to me. So there are a couple of ways for vesting that the company can set up. One is known as cliff vesting, okay, because it's sort of all or nothing, okay, like falling off a cliff. Here an employee is 0% vested if they've worked for less than 3 years, and then 100% vested if they worked for 3 or more years. So if you work for 2 years for the company, okay, and you leave, you have none of the money that the employer contributed to your account. But if you stay 3 years or more, you get 100% of what they contributed. Okay, the second approach is referred to as graduated vesting. Here, vesting takes place over several years. So after 2 years of service, you're 20% vested, 3 years 40%, 4 years 60%. Okay, after 6 years of service, you're 100% vested. So this is the case where it takes a little bit longer, but if you leave after 2 years, you still get some of the money. If you leave after 3 years, you still get some of the money. So you don't necessarily have to stay 6 years to get some of it, but if you stay 6, you're entitled to all of it. And a final note is that plans can allow employees rights to the employer-provided benefits sooner if they desire. So they can say that, look, we're making a contribution to your defined contribution plan, or okay, we're matching it, and you are immediately vested. So that means that if I left, in my first year, what contribution my employer made would be mine to take with me, if that's what the employer chose to do. But at a minimum, they have to meet those government vesting requirements. And they're set up so that an employer can't tell an employee, look, you have to work here for 20 years before you get any of the money that we contributed. And then maybe they've worked there 19 years and then they fire them and they get nothing. So they've set up these rules that require that employers vest on one of those schedules, either the graduated schedule or the cliff vesting schedule.